Hello, my name is Soyoung Lee. I'm the Chief Curator at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm honored and pleased to speak today about Korean art and public diplomacy. So in looking back on the last 2 decades of the 2000s, in today's short lecture, I'd like to explore how Korean art, particularly in North America and especially in the US, have evolved in its impact, its consciousness among the American public, and its presence in particular in museums. So from the 2000s to today in particular, I would say that there's been a transformed landscape of Korean art and culture in the US, and looking specifically at how Korean art has been presented, received, and impacted within the museum world and beyond to the public. We can trace how through the establishment of Korean galleries, the presentation of Korean collections around the US within museums, and through exhibitions, as well as development of expertise, that there's been a remarkable sort of expansion in the spread of, shall we say, cultural diplomacy through particularly traditional art in the realm of museums or the museum world. So I'd like to speak about 3 different areas, and in particular areas that the Korea Foundation has been instrumental in helping to develop in its sort of cultural and public diplomacy within the US through the arts. One is the establishment and development of Korean galleries at museums around the US. 2 is exhibitions, presentations of art collections within the US, as well as exhibitions through loans from major museums in South Korea. And 3, development of expertise or experts, people power, people who know, love, and care for Korean art and help to spread the enthusiasm around Korean art within the museum world and beyond. So looking at Korean galleries, why do physical spaces matter? Starting in the mid-1990s and continuing into the 2000s, a number of Korean galleries were established at both major museums around metropolises around the US, so along the Western Coast, New York, and the Northeastern regions in particular, but also at museums with significant Korean collections, and importantly at select university museums within academia, where the next generation can be trained and be exposed to Korean art. So I'll take the example of a museum with which I'm intimately familiar, having been the Korean art curator for about 15 years until recently, which is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which of course is often considered one of 3 most important and largest major museums in the world. And the Korean Gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art opened, as many people know, in 1998. So that's no small factor. Many Koreans, when I worked there, like to complain that the size of the Korean Gallery is rather small. That is a fact relative to many other galleries. But given that it was established in '98 and the Met was established in the late 19th century, so more than 100 years after the museum first opened, and the fact that there is a Korean gallery has been a significant, has had significant impact in the way that both New Yorkers and the international audience that come to the Met have been able to experience and come to love Korean art. So through the establishment of physical spaces where the figural space of Korean art and culture, where Korean art and culture can be experienced, appreciated, and then beyond that space, as people come and go, can spread throughout the public, has been a truly transformative factor in the public diplomacy around Korean art that Korea Foundation and other South Korean government agencies have been really involved in over the last 20 years. So within the US museums, a number of Korean galleries were established, many of which, of course, had, if not large in number, fairly significant collections of Korean art, so that there's a dedicated space in which local audiences, national audiences, and in cases of major museums, international audiences can come and learn repeatedly about Korean art in its many different layers. I'd like to call attention, actually, though most people will probably be most familiar with places like the Met or LACMA or Asian Museum of San Francisco or Boston, these big museums. But the impact, I think, that Korean galleries established at universities and colleges in regional areas, such as the Harn Museum at the University of Florida or the Michigan University Museum of Art, where there are regional hubs, it's also been incredibly influential to have Korean spaces for Korean art, where local and national audiences or regional audiences can repeatedly and in a sustained way experience Korean art. But of course, what is space without art? So that's where exhibitions come in. And it's through sustained presentations of a host of different contents of Korean art that the spread of Korean culture has been really significant in the last 20 years. And again, I'll cite the place that I know best, which is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Prior to my time, at the time that the Korean Gallery opened in 1998, with a major exhibition that utilized both the Met's own collection and significant important loans from many different museums in Korea. That was kind of a turning point, a pivot within, I would say, not only the Met's history with Asian art, but the New Yorkers' perception of Asia and of Korea, of course. And exhibitions that run the gamut from focusing on particular periods, such as the early Chosun period, Art of the Korean Renaissance, which was an exhibition that I organized in 2009, or a much bigger sort of kind of blockbuster exhibition of Chosun dynasty that toured US museums in Philadelphia, LACMA, and Houston Museum of Fine Arts, again, with incredible support from both the South Korean government and major museums within Korea, which have occurred more recently in 2014, to large exhibitions, small exhibitions that are either sort of, treasures of Korea or focusing on more esoteric and yet impactful subjects within Korean art have been displayed at a number of museums at various geographical locations in the US between 2000 and continuing to this day. So it's not that there's a one-time sort of star power of an exhibition and then Korean art disappears from museums or from public consciousness. There's been a sustained effort on the part of experts here working within the museums, but also with the South Korean government and many museums in Korea to organize a number of different exhibitions on a range of topics in Korean art within the last 20 years that has really layered the public's understanding of what traditional Korean art means, what its place is within East Asia, and what its place might be in the global context today. What exhibitions on Korean art does for the American public is to build visual and intellectual literacy around Korean culture. And so it's not simply looking at beautiful things, which of course is important. That aesthetic enjoyment is one of the sort of direct contact with actual art and aesthetic enjoyment is something that obviously many people seek in their experiences of museums. But it's also about learning, that education, of learning about a culture other than your own, and learning that contributes to a more layered and complicated store of knowledge about the world around you that museum-going publics have been seeking, and that these exhibitions around Korean art have been contributing. Again, elevation of visual and intellectual literacy that is so important in today's globalized world. Among some of the exhibitions that have really made a difference in public diplomacy around Korean culture and art, and in the American public's understanding and appreciation of Korean art, have been, again, exhibitions that focus on either particular mediums like paintings, for example, Cleveland's 2017 exhibition around 책거리, painted screens, or much earlier in 2003, a major exhibition on Goryeo Dynasty, which at the Asian Art Museum San Francisco, which of course Goryeo is considered one of the golden ages of Korean culture. And so exhibitions like that have transformed the public's understanding of Korean art in a way that really nothing else can, that direct connection with the cultural artifacts. And one other factor that makes these exhibitions even more transformative is precisely the fact that there is such a limited number and amount of Korean art available within US museums themselves. While some of the museums have stellar and a breadth of collection of Korean art, for the most part, unlike Chinese or Japanese art, there's a dearth of Korean art available in the museum's own collections. And so encountering art that hadn't been as familiar to American publics through loans that come from Korea has really been transformative. And that's the work that I have been involved with at the Metropolitan Museum. And that kind of work where you know that you're bringing unfamiliar material that brings not only joy, but elevates people's understanding not only of Korean culture, but of themselves, feels truly as such a worthwhile effort. The third theme that I'll touch on today is the development of expertise, of intellectual currency, shall we say. And that is, of course, of curators and other keepers and educators of art within museums, who are the keys, who are really the kind of bridges, the diplomats, the ambassadors, connecting the art themselves, but also the museum's mission with the public outside of the museums, the museum-going audiences, which can be local, regional, national, and of course in certain cities and certain museums, absolutely international. So even today, there are really only a handful of museums within the US with dedicated curators whose expertise is in Korean art. Over the last 20 years, an incredible strategy by the Korea Foundation to focus on the training of curators whose expertise lie in different parts of Asia, China, sometimes Japan, South Asia, Southeast Asia, but who oversee Korean collections within their museums, and really transforming their knowledge as well as their dedication and commitment to Korean art has changed the landscape of how museums operate and how museums present Korean art. So the curator workshops that Korea Foundation conducted for over a decade, through the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, have brought annually a small group of curators of Asian art, again, with expertise in other than Korea, but who oversee Korean collections in their museums, annually would bring to Korea, and for a sustained period of time through lectures, seminars, as well as field trips to museums, archaeological sites, and so forth, have really expanded not only these specialists' knowledge of Korea, but expanded their network of colleagues within the US who are also overseeing Korea, and through these workshops have come to not only love Korean art more, but become that much more committed to presenting Korean art in ways that they hadn't thought were possible before. So that network of colleagues within the US, but of course the network of colleagues, experts, and others within South Korea. Building on that over the course of more than a decade, we have now in the US a really expanded network of ambassadors, experts who are contributing immeasurably to the expansion of presentations of Korean art, programs around Korean art, so both physical and conceptual programs around Korean art and culture. So without these experts, without these people, the physical space and the object would not come to life. And so the intellectual and the intellectual authority and the deep dedication and the network really permitted in kind of an explosive expansion of presentations of Korean art in the last 20 years. In the Curator workshops that that Korea Foundation organized annually for a number of years, they covered a great range of subjects, from ancient Korean art and archaeology to medium specific, whether it's ceramics or paintings, to subject matter specific areas, whether it's Buddhist art or Confucianism, and expanded also into modern and contemporary art. Now, while most museums focus in the US have thus far been on traditional, shall we say, pre-modern, pre-20th century Korean art, the field of modern and contemporary Korean art, and really, I suppose, global art that involves Korean artists, is a field that probably still needs to be tapped, and is perhaps an area that is rich for mining in the future. Where do we go from here? What does the future of public diplomacy around Korean art look like? What are the challenges, and what are the areas that we still need to expand into? In these days of the coronavirus pandemic, as this lecture demonstrates, a recorded lecture through Zoom rather than my coming to you personally, we've discovered a myriad possibilities in the digital realm, in the virtual world. And I think it's certainly museums have discovered the potential of reaching so many more audiences through the digital world. I think that this is an area, even post-COVID, if such a world does come, that the digital possibilities really need to be explored further in terms of spreading the impact of Korean art and culture. While, of course, personal experience of the art, going to the museums, going to an exhibition, as well as experiencing through programming, lectures, performances, is so important and something that cannot be replaced, and that is integral to the expansion of the impact of Korean art and culture and public diplomacy. We have discovered that, in fact, layered upon that, it's important to take advantage of what the digital realm offers and the potential to reach the kinds of audiences through the virtual realm that one simply can't in the physical world. And so that is an area, I think, that is with rich potential for the future. In terms of the Korean art itself, much of government-involved public diplomacy has centered on sort of a nationalist, shall we say, certainly a national framework of Korean art, and building on what is unique about Korean art. It's important from here on also to think very much about the audiences, and the fact that many do come with prior knowledge of cultures beyond Korea. So to be able to explain, to be able to situate Korean art within the context of East Asia, Korean art in the global context today, to help our public understand the place of Korean art within a larger world, will be all the more important. To pivot from a more focused national or nationalist perspective to a more global perspective of Korea's position within the world, will have a very different impact on furthering sort of appreciation of Korean culture going forward. And then, of course, while many museums thus far have been focused, as I said, on pre-modern traditional Korean art, there's the whole field of modern 20th century and 21st century ongoing current contemporary art that is still to be mined. Granted, in recent years, aspects of modern and contemporary Korean art, in particular, who can forget the incredible sort of trend around 단색화 for a few years here in the US and around the world, actually, and explosive in the art market, but also in museum exhibitions with publications and so forth. Now, of course, certain names and movements have become or were already and have become sort of household names. Obviously, artists like Nam Jun-paek or Baek Nam-jun and Liu Fan or Yu Hwan are well known and well established within the global context, but the field of modern art in the US or in the Western world is still so dominated by a perspective anchored in European and American, Western modern art. And there's so much room still for the movements of Korean modern art to sort of establish its place within the global modern art movement, and of course in contemporary art. And so if we were to perhaps take the model of curator workshops of Korea Foundation of the past and take that into the world of modern and contemporary art, for example, why not have modern and contemporary curators who are not dealing with perhaps Asia or know anything about Korean art, but invite them to Korea and for them as experts of the global modern contemporary field to experience and analyze and also elevate Korean art and be able to show that element within their own museums after experiencing them in Korea. That model would work extremely well transferred into the modern contemporary field. And then when we talk about contemporary, of course, there's popular culture. Right now, I mean, for the past several years, but certainly in these moments, K-pop, we're talking, of course, about music, but including all kinds of popular culture, whether it's food, K-drama, movies. Who would have thought that one could watch K-drama like anything through Netflix and Hulu? Just even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would not have thought that. You know, K-pop explosive, global charts, the incredible phenomenon of K-pop fans around the world, non-Korean K-pop fans who are not only driving the music market, but who have their expansive impact and influence in fields far from culture, such as politics in the US or social justice, as we've seen in recent movements, is incredible. And to think about this next generation who will be the ones leading, you know, all of the cultures around the globe. What is this next generation interested in beyond K-pop? Is there using their love, ferocious commitment to Korean popular culture? Is there a way to then introduce them into the sort of the past that is just as alive as those boy bands on the stages, that there's a connection to the traditions of Korea that animate Korean popular culture? A long shot, perhaps, but I think all that to say that to keep our focus on the next generation, a museum public, museum audiences in the US, certainly, I think around the world, tend to be, you know, not your sort of the youth generation. And the challenge for the future of the cultural world is to bring the next generation into the museum world, into the traditional arts, as well as popular culture. Thank you.